We have this really deeply ingrained societal expectation that grief acts exactly like a physical injury.
Right, yeah, like a broken bone or something.
Exactly. You experience a loss and it is excruciating, but then days pass, weeks pass, and eventually the bleeding stops. You get a scab.
Time heals all wounds, right? That's the cliche.
That's the cliche. The pain slowly fades into a scar. But what happens when the medical community realizes that a breaking heart isn't just a metaphor, but like a literal, treatable clinical condition?
Oh man, it changes everything.
It really does. What happens when you look at the calendar and a whole year has passed and that emotional wound hasn't clotted at all? It is still just as fresh, just as debilitating as day one.
And I mean, that is a terrifying reality for the person experiencing it. And for a very long time, it was a reality that the medical field, they just didn't quite know how to categorize it.
Which is exactly why the sources you sent over for today's deep dive are so crucial. Welcome, by the way, to today's deep dive.
Yes, glad to be here exploring this with you.
So you provided us with a stack of clinical insights detailing a newly classified condition called prolonged grief disorder, or PGD.
PGD, right?
And alongside that, you shared the specifics of a really unique, specialized support service in Georgia called Coping and Healing Counseling.
Yes, CHC. The operational model they have is fascinating.
It really is. So our mission today is to map out this major shift in how the medical world understands grief. We're going to explore the precise mechanics of when natural mourning turns into a clinical emergency.
And then, obviously, we need to look at the practical side.
Exactly, a practical, real-world roadmap for getting the highly specialized help required to treat it. So, okay, let's unpack this. We are looking at a fundamental shift in the diagnostic rulebook.
Precisely. I mean, to understand the magnitude of this, you really have to look at the DSM-5-TR.
Right, the big psychiatric manual.
Yeah. The Bible of Psychiatry. For the DSM to actually update its text and officially include a new classification like prolonged grief disorder, which, clinicians used to just refer to as complicated grief, they had to cross a massive evidentiary threshold.
It's not something they take lightly.
Not at all. By putting PGD in the manual, the psychiatric community is making a definitive, legally and medically binding statement
And what's that statement?
that there is a form of grief that is entirely distinct from the natural mourning process. It's not just feeling sad for a long time. It is a biological and psychological interruption.
Wow. And the sources are, they're incredibly specific about the timeline of that interruption.
Yeah, the timelines are strict.
Right, like for adults, a PGD diagnosis requires that this meaningful impairment lasts 12 more months after the loss.
12 months.
12 months, that is an entire lap around the sun. I mean, you have gone through every major holiday, every birthday, every changing season without that person, and the impairment hasn't lessened at all.
Yeah, the functional impairment is just as severe.
And for children, the timeline is even shorter. It's 6 or more months.
Right. And we should really pause on that difference because 6 months in the developmental timeline of a child is a massive cognitive era.
Oh, sure, they change so fast.
Exactly. A child's perception of time, their emotional processing speed, and the rapid development of their neural pathways. It all means that 6 months of interrupted, debilitating grief does the equivalent damage of a year or more in an adult brain.
That is, wow. So going back to that initial idea of how we view grief, is typical mourning like a wound that slowly scars over, whereas PGD is a physiological failure to clot?
Yeah, that's a great way to look at it.
Like the wound simply stays open and vulnerable to infection indefinitely.
What's fascinating here is how perfectly that medical analogy captures the psychological reality of the condition. And that is exactly why this DSM-5-TR classification matters so much to the individual sufferer.
Because it validates it.
Exactly. Think about the cultural baggage we attach to grief, For decades, if someone was still utterly paralyzed by the loss of a spouse or a child a year or two later, society, and honestly, often the sufferers themselves, viewed it as a personal failing.
Oh, totally. A lack of resilience, a refusal to, move
You
on.
just need to get over it.
Right. People whisper they just aren't trying to get better.
Exactly. It was treated as a moral or spiritual weakness. By codifying it as prolonged grief disorder, it entirely shifts the narrative.
It gives it a name.
It gives it a name, and it validates the sufferer's experience by saying, this is not your fault.
Hmm.
You aren't weak, your natural healing mechanism has simply stalled, and you have a recognized treatable condition.
That shift from blame to treatment, I mean, that has to be a profound relief for people.
Absolutely life-changing.
But, understanding that clinical timeline, that 12-month or 6-month mark, is really only the outer boundary of the condition.
Hmm.
To actually grasp the severity of this, we need to look at what this unhealed wound actually looked like on a random Tuesday morning.
Yeah, the day-to-day reality.
Right. And the clinical data you shared notes that approximately 7 to 10% of bereaved adults meet the criteria for PGD.
Which is a huge number if you think about how many people experience loss.
It's millions of people, and it spikes even higher when the loss is sudden or violent.
Yes, because a sudden, violent loss introduces profound trauma and shock into the system. It essentially short-circuits the brain's ability to even initiate the natural mourning sequence.
The symptoms outlined here are just devastating. We're talking about an intense, unyielding yearning for the deceased,
Yeah, an active longing.
a profound difficulty in accepting the death at all. But the symptom that really stopped me in my tracks when reading this was identity disruption.
Oh, identity disruption is arguably the most disorienting mechanic of PGD.
Because we aren't just talking about functional impairment where you can't do your laundry or go to work. We are talking about a total collapse of the self.
Right. Think about how we build our identities. We construct who we are in relation to the people around us.
Like our roles.
Exactly. I am a spouse, I am a parent, I am a best friend. When that other person is suddenly gone, the role that defined your daily existence is functionally obsolete.
Yeah. It's like they were a load-bearing wall in the architecture of your identity.
Yeah.
It isn't just that a piece of furniture was removed from the room. The load-bearing wall is gone and the entire house caves in. You literally do not know who you are in a reality where they don't exist.
That is a phenomenal way to visualize it.
You're
You are left entirely unmoored in the rubble of your own self-concept.
I do want to push back on something here, though, because looking at these symptoms, I'm sure a question is popping up for you listening right now.
Okay, let's hear it.
If a patient is experiencing identity collapse, intense lethargy, and they are so functionally impaired they literally can't get out of bed, why can't a doctor just prescribe standard antidepressants and a standard talk therapy regimen? Aren't those symptoms basically a carbon copy of major depressive disorder?
This raises an important question, and it actually gets to the very core of why PGD needed its own specific diagnosis in the DSM-5-TR.
Because on paper, they look similar.
Exactly. On the surface, if a general practitioner looks at a PGD patient, they might just see severe depression. The patient is withdrawn, joyless, maybe unable to maintain basic hygiene.
Right.
But the underlying mechanics driving those behaviors are completely different. General depression is typically characterized by a pervasive global emptiness, a negative view of oneself, and a general disinterest in the world.
A sort of gray fog that blankets everything indiscriminately.
Right. But PGD is hyper-specific. The emotional pain isn't a gray fog. It is a laser beam entirely tethered to the lost loved one.
Ah.
It is driven by that intense yearning. Because the root cause of the impairment is a stalled grief response, rather than a global neurochemical depression, standard depression treatments alone consistently fail these patients.
Wow, so an SSRI just isn't going to cut it.
The sources are definitive on this. You cannot just medicate the lethargy. You have to treat the root trauma of the interrupted grief process.
So, okay, if standard talk therapy doesn't work, and you can't just talk it out or throw an antidepressant at it, what is the actual mechanism of treatment?
Yeah.
Like, if someone is experiencing identity disruption, are clinicians using exposure therapy? How do you reconstruct a collapsed identity?
You're actually incredibly close to the mark with that guess.
Really? Exposure therapy?
Well, the clinical insights point to highly specialized evidence-based interventions, specifically complicated grief therapy, or CGT, and grief-focused cognitive behavioral therapy.
Okay.
And yes, CGT actually borrows mechanics from exposure therapy. A clinician trained in CGT will gently guide the patient to recount the story of the death.
That sounds grueling.
It's incredibly hard work. The goal is to slowly reduce the intense avoidance and the trauma responses associated with the loss. It is about helping the brain actually process the finality of the death while simultaneously working on a restoration phase.
Restoration phase.
Yeah.
Setting small goals.
Exactly. Setting small, future-oriented goals to rebuild that collapsed, load-bearing wall of their identity.
Which makes total clinical sense, but that immediately introduces a massive, almost impossible paradox.
The access problem.
Exactly, the access problem. So we have this newly defined paralyzing condition, But if a core symptom of PGD is severe functional impairment, meaning the patient physically cannot muster the energy to leave their house, how are they supposed to get to a clinic to receive this highly specialized exposure therapy?
They often don't. That's the tragedy.
Right. If getting out of bed feels like moving through wet concrete, the idea of researching specialists, driving across town, finding parking, and then filling out intake forms in a sterile waiting room with fluorescent lights, it's an insurmountable barrier.
It really is.
The people who need the help the most are physically and psychologically trapped in their homes.
It's a cruel catch-22 of mental health care. The geographical and physical limitations of the traditional brick-and-mortar therapy model leave PGD sufferers entirely isolated.
Which is exactly why the practical solution you shared in your sources is so brilliant.
Yes, let's get into that.
This brings us to Coping and Healing Counseling, or CHC. This is a therapy practice based in Georgia that seems, honestly, specifically engineered to solve this exact logistical paradox.
It really does.
They are a HIPAA-compliant 100% telehealth practice. Because they operate virtually, they serve all 159 counties in Georgia.
The scale of that accessibility is staggering when you think about it.
All 159 counties.
We are talking about bypassing the physical limitations of the patient, yes, but also reaching people in deep rural areas. Communities where a clinician specifically certified in complicated grief therapy might literally be a 3-hour drive away.
It completely eradicates what I call the waiting room barrier.
I like that phrase.
Thanks. If your identity is shattered and you are weeping uncontrollably, you don't have to put on a brave face for the receptionist.
No, you don't.
You don't even have to get dressed. You can access highly specialized grief-informed care from the safety, privacy, and comfort of your own couch.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, though, a telehealth connection is really only as good as the person on the other side of the screen.
That's a very fair point.
The sources highlight that CHC has a diverse, culturally competent team of 15-plus licensed therapists. So we're talking licensed clinical social workers, licensed professional counselors, and licensed marriage and family therapists. But we really need to focus on that phrase, culturally competent.
Yeah, I noticed that was emphasized heavily in the materials. How does cultural competence specifically alter the mechanics of treating prolonged grief disorder?
Well, think about it. The entire concept of mourning is fundamentally governed by culture.
Right.
The timeline society expects you to follow, the rituals you use to process the death, how you speak about the deceased. It is all intimately tied to your background.
Give me an example of how that plays out clinically.
Take, for instance, certain cultures where stoicism is demanded. You have to be strong. Versus cultures where extended public wailing, wearing specific garments for a year, or long periods of isolation are communal requirements for honoring the dead.
Oh, I see. If a therapist isn't culturally aware, they might look at a completely normal, healthy cultural mourning practice and mistakenly pathologize it as a symptom of PGD.
Exactly. Why are you wearing black every day? Well, it's my culture. Or they face the dangerous reverse. They might miss the subtle signs of PGD entirely because they misinterpret a patient's cultural baseline.
Oh, yeah.
To effectively guide someone through the exposure elements of complicated grief therapy, the therapist has to intimately understand the cultural scaffolding of that patient's life. The patient must feel deeply, intrinsically understood, or they will never trust the clinician enough to do the painful work of rebuilding their identity.
That makes perfect sense. So CHC is providing this incredibly nuanced, culturally competent telehealth to all 159 counties in Georgia. But let's look at the financial reality of this.
Always the elephant in the room.
Always. Delivering high-level specialized care is a logistical triumph, sure, but it only matters if the patient logging on can actually afford to pay for the session.
Exactly.
Specialized therapy is notoriously expensive, and a person suffering from PGD is likely already dealing with lost wages or financial instability due to their functional impairment.
Right. The barrier to entry isn't just the waiting room, it's the billing department. True accessibility has to solve both of those things.
And looking at the materials, CHC has essentially dismantled the financial barriers right alongside the geographical ones.
It's impressive.
First, their umbrella of care is massive. They don't just treat grief, they treat anxiety, depression, trauma, PTSD, relationship issues, and severe stress.
A very comprehensive clinic.
Yeah, and they do this across individual therapy, couples therapy, family therapy, and team therapy for ages 13 and up.
And how are they structuring the cost for that level of comprehensive care?
This is the part that genuinely surprised me. For patients utilizing Medicaid, there is a $0 copay.
Let's just pause on that. $0.
Zero.
for specialized, licensed clinical mental health care.
It's remarkable. And for patients with commercial insurance, the sources list that they accept Aetna, Cigna, Blue Cross Blue Shield, United Healthcare, and Humana. The typical copay per session falls somewhere between $10 and $40.
Wow.
We are talking about the price of a couple of lattes to receive an hour of culturally competent, targeted therapy that could literally give you your life back.
That is true accessibility.
It really is. By the way, if you are listening from Georgia and this is resonating, you can reach them at 44832-0102 or just go to checktherapy.com.
Highly recommend looking them up.
So what does this all mean when we take these abstract concepts and put them into a real-world scenario?
Let's run a hypothetical.
Yeah. We have the clinical timelines for PGD, we have the different therapy formats like teen and couples counseling, and we have this accessible telehealth model. Let's imagine a household to see how this all connects.
Okay, set the scene.
A family experiences a sudden, tragic loss. We have two parents and a 14-year-old teenager, and they are all trapped under the same roof, grieving the exact same loss.
That is the perfect crucible to show why CHC's specific structure is so vital. Think back to the clinical timelines we discussed at the very beginning.
The 12 months versus 6 months.
Right. PGD requires 12 months of impairment for an adult diagnosis, but only 6 months for a child.
Okay, so let's say we are 8 months out from the tragedy.
At 8 months, the psychological reality inside that house is incredibly fractured. The parents are undoubtedly drowning in their grief, struggling to maintain the household, but clinically speaking, they haven't crossed that 12-month threshold to be officially diagnosed with PGD.
Right, they're still technically in the acute phase.
Exactly. The 14-year-old, however, is a completely different story.
Yeah.
They are past the 6-month mark. Let's say their grades have collapsed. They are isolating in their room. Their identity as a student and a friend is entirely disrupted.
So the teenager meets the criteria for a severe clinical condition.
Yes, while the parents are still technically in the window of acute natural mourning.
That sounds like a recipe for massive friction. You have completely different diagnostic realities and emotional processing speeds colliding in the kitchen every single morning.
Oh, the tension would be unbearable.
The parents might be frustrated that the teen is acting out, while the teen feels entirely alienated because the parents aren't validating the severity of their collapse.
Precisely. And in a traditional model, trying to solve that is a logistical nightmare.
How so?
Well, you'd have to find a pediatric grief specialist across town for the teen. Then maybe try to find a separate marriage counselor for the parents who are snapping at each other from the stress.
And driving to 2 different clinics.
Exactly. And none of those clinicians are talking to one another. But with CHC's model, that entire fractured family unit is treated under one virtual roof.
Oh, that makes so much sense. The 14-year-old logs on from their bedroom and gets specialized, individual, complicated grief therapy tailored to a developing brain. At the same time, the parents can engage in couples counseling to navigate the immense marital stress that grief causes. Or they can all come together for a virtual family therapy session to learn how to communicate their disparate grieving timelines without tearing each other apart.
It creates a cohesive, culturally competent support system that addresses the trauma from every angle.
Yeah.
It's not just treating an isolated symptom, it is stabilizing the entire emotional ecosystem of the family.
It is incredibly rare to see complex clinical theory like the DSM-5-TR update translate so seamlessly into a practical, accessible service that actually meets people exactly where they are.
It really is. When you step back and synthesize everything we've explored today, the mechanics of identity disruption, the specific interventions of CGT, the telehealth solutions, the core takeaway from the sources you provided is actually deeply empowering.
It is, and it is a truth that I hope anyone listening who is hurting right now absorbs completely. If grief is still keeping you from living a year later, if it has fundamentally stopped your life in its tracks and left you feeling broken, it is absolutely not a weakness.
Hear, hear.
It is not a lack of willpower or a character flaw. It is a medically recognized, highly treatable clinical condition. Your healing process simply got interrupted, and the specialized, accessible help required to restart that process is out there.
To close out our deep dive today, I want to leave you with a philosophical question built on these clinical facts.
Oh, I love these.
We spent this time discussing how the psychiatric manuals now officially recognize that our very identity can be disrupted or even collapse due to the loss of someone else.
Right, the load-bearing wall.
Exactly. If the medical community acknowledges that losing a loved one can literally shatter the architecture of ourself, it really makes you wonder, how much of our own identity is actually ours? and how much of it is just built on the people we love.
Wow. That is a profound thought to sit with. And, to return to where we started, when that emotional wound refuses to turn into a scar, you don't have to just suffer in the dark and wait for time to do a job it clearly isn't doing.
You don't. There's help.
You can reach out, bypass the waiting room, and get the right kind of care to finally let it heal. Thank you so much for bringing these incredibly moving and important sources to the table, and for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time.